Archives. Alan, are you ready for to start the webinar?
Yes, I'm ready, Barbara.
Thank you.
Are we all set? If we can advance the slide, Becky. So welcome everyone. Welcome to the SHRAB wrap-up. Today's agenda is we're going to hear from the three individuals, Dave Jones, Kathy Marquis, and Dennis Pressler, who did the last three SHRAB topic webinars, or discussion roundtables, excuse me, sorry. So we're going to hear from them, like a wrap up of what each of those were and what we sort of have taken away from them. And then we're going to have some time for question and answer and discussion, and then stay tuned for some upcoming programming from CoSA. And now I'm going to turn it over to John Savage with Apex Software, who's sponsoring these SHRAB roundtables for some words. John?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Selvage, president of Apex Software, makers of Axiom archive management software. I want to just take the opportunity to welcome you one last time to the SHRAB Roundtable. In this particular case, the results review, recap of all the webinar series we've had over the last 3 weeks. Speaking for myself, I've really enjoyed these sessions and learned so much about how the various SHRABs are promoting their respective archives. Personally, I was particularly interested in the areas where they're raising awareness to the general public, such as through the Traveling Archivist Program. So I was very excited about those kinds of projects. I think in doing those kinds of projects, it gives us all the opportunity to really appreciate our shared heritage. So again, I'm looking forward to this final discussion. And once again, we at Apex Software are grateful to the CoSA leadership team for allowing us to sponsor these discussions. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Alan.
All right. Thank you, John. We can advance the slide, please. So again, as I mentioned, we're going to hear from these presenters today on the wrap-up, and so I'm going to pass it off to Dave Jones about SHRAB funding.
Well, hello, everybody, and let me be the very first one to say Happy Archives Month. We're having a big party here in Illinois, so we'll try to keep it down to a dull roar. First, I do want to thank Apex Software for sponsoring these, all three of the previous webinars and today's as well. It's just very much appreciated. I was the host or the presenter, I guess, at the first roundtable, where I was joined by Dan Stokes, which quite honestly made my job very easy. For those of you who were not at that roundtable, that was probably of the three the one that was most similar to what we have at the annual meeting, where we have a SHRAB meeting and Dan Stokes shows up, and in the past, Kathleen Williams has shown up, and they talk about what's going on. I think for mine, that was probably the closest, because what we were talking about was SHRAB funding. Can we do the next slide, Becky? So we talked about different ways in SHRAB funding. When we began that meeting, we, first of all, because it was the first one, we gave a brief history of what the SHRABs were, why they were created, and what their role was. And, you know, they were created in the 1970s by the NHPRC. We are, for better or worse, their children. And our role is to assist the NHPRC within the states. And that's always important to remember, especially when we go to them as often as we do asking for money. But the bottom line is we've been around for a long time. We talked about mostly about the state board programming grants. Since 1976, the NHPRC has given SHRABs $20 million. Before state programming grants, there were the SNAP grants. There's currently two kinds of state programming grants. There's level one, where you can get up to $12,000 a year. That's mostly for administrative costs and some, well, mostly administrative costs for the SHRAB themselves. It's a shorter application, and it's often, from what Dan said, it's often mostly used to get a SHRAB up and running. And not every SHRAB in every state is active, although one of the things that came out of this roundtable was we certainly encourage you to have an active SHRAB. and the NHPRC will help you in any way it can. And quite honestly, most of the other state archives who have active SHRABs, if you have questions, we're always willing to help you and give you advice. I love giving advice because it's free. The other type of state partnership grant is state board programming grants, I should say, is up to $40,000 for 2 years. Illinois, for example, is in the second year of an $80,000 grant, $40,000 a year. And these are for not just administrative costs, but also special projects. In Illinois, for example, we do a Regrant Program. We give out scholarships. We sponsor classes. We used to use the grant for Archives Month posters, but now the state of Illinois picks that up. One thing that came out of our meeting is half the states don't participate in the SNAP grant program, in the board programming grants. I sometimes go back and call it SNAP grants, but about half the states, half the SHRABs, 20 to 25 states, don't participate. Sometimes it's because they don't have an active board. But I think one thing that I tried to emphasize at this roundtable was, it's money there for the taking that the NHPRC wants to give to your state to promote archives, to promote access to historical records. So again, we just strongly encourage states to participate in the state board programming grants. We had a lot of questions about those grants as they are now. Dan made it very clear due to the COVID, if you've applied for a grant and you need an extension for one of your programs, they're very liberal on giving those out. We all understand what COVID's like. We had questions on cost sharing. There is cost sharing. The states are expected to pick up a little bit of cost share. If we can have the next slide, please. So, organizing my notes here. So there is some cost share, but you can, for those states who pay, for example, CoSA dues, that can be a part of the cost share. Other questions, will the NHPRC be willing to look if you submit a draft to them of a grant proposal? They will, especially if you send it roughly 6 months out. The NHPRC meets to discuss these grants in November. The draft deadline, again, which is optional, is early April. The final deadline to get in one of these grant applications is June. The NHPRC meets in November, and then the grant starts the following year. We had some tips and ideas on what to do with SHRAB funding. If you receive funding from the NHPRC, of course, publicize that you got the funding, both yourself and if you do Regrant Programs or even scholarships, have your recipients publicize that how good the NHPRC is and, of course, how good your SHRAB is. That's probably one of the larger things I know that the NHPRC really likes to see is they like to see, it's a commission. They have their own board who wants to see how good they're doing. So publicity is so important for when you get a grant from the NHPRC, and keep that in mind. And there's so many different means to publicize it. I mean, you've got the local means, whether it's your own Facebook or website, or, you can publicize, you can send information to the National Archives and the NHPRC, and they'll publicize it on their sites as well. So publicity is very important to the NHPRC, and of course these days they're liking anything that's related digitally, that's related to online access. So that's another, tip on how to get a grant. So we talked, needless to say, a lot about these state board programming grants, but we also talked about other ways to fund SHRABs. Some SHRABs actually receive state funding. I think Arizona gets an appropriation from the legislature that helps them with funding their SHRAB. Some SHRABs, like in Louisiana, have a foundation that can help with the matches. So something to look into is obviously a foundation. The NHPRC offers other grants besides the state board programming grants, larger grants. You may want to think about, if you have a SHRAB, working with other regional SHRABs on a project, and all of you going in on a grant application. You don't have to go to the NHPRC for a grant. There's other grant organizations out there, both at the federal level and probably at the state level. So there's other ways to fund a SHRAB as well, and that was a important, I think, area of discussion that we had. Right now it is Archives Month. Happy Archives Month again. The NHPRC is collecting Archives Month posters, so by all means send copies of those to the NHPRC and also to CoSA as well. And actually with that, next slide please. If you have questions about SHRAB funding, especially through NHPRC, here's a link to it, or you can always call Dan Stokes. Because of the COVID, I now have his home phone number, so if you call me offline, I'm more than happy to give it out. Right, Dan? Anyway, I'll pass this back to Alan.
All right, thank you, Dave. And next we're going to hear from Kathy.
Okay. Sorry, I'm unmuting myself and making myself visible. So our discussion on traveling archivists, I selfishly took this one on because we're thinking about applying for a grant for this. And can I have the next slide, please? So I invited a number of people to join us who are involved with traveling archives in one way or another. And those people were, excuse me, Rachel Onoff, who's the roving archivist for the state of Vermont, Irene Gates, who is the roving archivist for the state of Massachusetts and had been on the job, I think, for a week when we talked to her. So she brought along her boss, who is Jack Warner, the archivist of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And then we also had Jody Foley from CoSA, who is the Montana State Archivist and supervises their traveling archivist program. And then we were glad to have Dan Stokes join us to talk about, at the end, we talked a little bit about what NHPRC might be looking for. Next slide. So just a really brief overview of these programs. Vermont has a full-time roving archivist, and that position is funded by the state now. And they they do assessments and inventories. And then one thing that Rachel really stresses is the follow-up support, that she's basically kind of there for people to ask even after their assessment has happened or after the site visit has happened. And then we heard from Massachusetts, and they also have a full-time roving archivist. And sites apply for a strategic assessment review. And they also have field fellowships. They didn't talk about that too much, but it's a program with Simmons students, and they're basically interns who provide, oh, thank you. Veronica just corrected me that Massachusetts is part-time. And they have the field fellowships for Simmons interns to do processing. And then in Montana, they have a student archivist, traveling archivist program, and they are grad students from all over the country who apply to be a traveling archivist. And the structure is really kind of interesting because each one of the board members mentors the student for a week out of their 10-week placement. But they also, they start out with Jody going to the placement, to the site with them to get kind of an overview of, yeah, they said they want X, is X what they really need? And then getting the students started in on what they're going to be doing for them, which is largely processing. And we also, in the comment section, we heard from Connecticut, who use personnel service agreements with consulting archivists who conduct site visits. And correct me if I'm wrong about that. And then I reminded everyone that this past fall, just about a year ago now, there was a SHRAB webinar where I think Jody and definitely Rachel talked in much more detail about their actual programs and what they do. So the link is there. Can I have the next slide? We talked about how you market your program and the usual suspects, media, using statewide networks of various kinds. And then I think it was Rachel, but I can't remember, said that she used workshops like emergency preparedness as a way to kind of bring people out of the woodwork and who might be looking for answers that a traveling archivist could help provide, and then encourage them to apply for assistance. Next slide. So we asked them a little bit about what they actually do. And they mostly had this in common. They would, this is when they selected someone to receive assistance. They start with a tour of the facility. They do some assessment on site and figure out where they're stuck, which was a really great term that Rachel kind of introduced into the conversation and we stuck with for most of the discussion. They make sure to listen and figure out what it is that people are actually doing and want help with. They provide training, and they often encourage an inventory as a starting step, because often people haven't done this or they haven't done it recently. And it also points out holes in what skills they have, what training they need, and also what they need help with. And then, as I mentioned earlier, be an ongoing resource when people have questions, even beyond the scope of your tour or your site visit or the preparation of a report. Next slide. So the biggest challenges that people reported was, so you go there, you have your assessment, you give them ideas about what they can do in the future, and then you leave. And they don't always immediately act on what you have or what you've given them by way of recommendations. So we didn't really talk about how you kind of nudge them into action, but that was one of the biggest difficulties that the traveling archivists ran into, getting past the inertia or just the confidence to implement the recommendations. And of course, not being able to process their collections for them, which in the case of the Simmons students and the Montana traveling archivists, you can actually do. So that's really nice. Next slide. So these were some of the recommendations that people had for things to think about if you're considering a program or if you're in the middle, if you have a program. They really recommended that the application be simple, and I just ran into that with my own SHRAB here. We asked a lot of questions over the years that I'm not sure we actually needed the answers to, and it was really stopping people from applying. Jody in particular recommended that it seems kind of intimidating to have a whole traveling archivist program, that you start with some small aspect of it and then you keep building as you gain momentum. Make sure that your board is fully committed. I would say Jody's board is fully committed since they're all acting as mentors. And that they're willing to help you find people who might be interested in applying but never have thought about it before. And as we mentioned, they recommended that you started with a survey, and in fact, in some cases, that's a baseline requirement for assistance, that they conduct a survey of their collections. And also that you know your audience, and that goes back to the listen recommendation from before, so that you can figure out what they really need. Next slide. A lot of times if collections are moving or if they've just experienced a disaster, that can be a time when they reach out to you for assistance, or you can reach out to them if you know that it's going on. And one of our participants asked if we thought that the recommendations from the traveling archivist could be used in future grant applications, and everyone said, oh yes, please, because it either points out the help that you need that's beyond the scope of the traveling archivist that you need grant help for, or it says, we had these problems, we worked on them, now we're at the next step, and that's where we need our grant money from. So, and I think it also shows a willingness to work on whatever it is that you have decided are the things that need to be managed in your archives. Again, the ongoing relationship, keep an open door. And then several of the traveling archivists recommended that you keep notes and statistics, I assume for future grant applications, but also to show your funders and your administration what you've been up to. And then we also mentioned that there are a lot more of these programs than we necessarily know about, and that it might be nice. I think CoSA is just in the process of updating its listserv. And we asked Barbara if maybe there could be essentially a sub-list for people who are running traveling archivist type programs, or who would like to, and would like to have a group of people just to consult about that particular topic. And it sounds like that's something that could happen in the future. Next slide. We did ask what hasn't worked. And Montana said that they started out asking, allowing any grad student to apply, and they decided that they needed to limit it to second-year students because they needed to have some idea of what an archives is all about before they were sent into to process or do other projects for an archives around the state. And then the Massachusetts Archives recommended that you start with a roving archivist and follow up with a regrant request. And that made a lot of sense. This came up several times in the discussion, where people ask for help and provide the assistance, and then you say, you know, if you want to go further in this particular project, you know, including digitization or processing, there are these SHRAB grants, and they could help you. They could help give you funding to hire someone to do them. So it could kind of be a 1-2 punch. Next slide. So the last set of questions that we had were about what can you do now? And Rachel talked about doing virtual workshops on grant writing and policies and procedures. We talked a little bit about whether you could do virtual training and processing. I don't think everybody was very enthusiastic about that. We were talking about, you know, how much fun it would be to be having the person walk around their collections with their laptop, and you know how seasick that makes you. So maybe that wouldn't be the best one. But also during this time, we can follow up with people who've had previous site visits, or talk with people that you would like to encourage to apply, either for that or for a regrant. And then there are also the possibility of working on digital exhibits and a collection portal, which we're doing here in Wyoming. And Jody mentioned Map Missoula, which I have listed the URL for, which is something that they're working on now when they can't go out and process in different repositories. And then the other thing that, that Rachel in particular is working on right now is building networks and making sure that she's aware of the kinds of digitization and emergency response and other kinds of support that are available around the state, because that's part of what she offers as the traveling archivist, is to connect her sites with those resources. So that was most of it. There was one other question that came up. Someone asked Dan Stokes if he thought it would be a good idea to have a separate funding stream just for traveling archives programs. And his answer was basically that they were trying to keep their funding streams more all-inclusive, so as not to discourage more innovative ideas or newer ideas. And that there were certainly ways to work traveling archivists into the grant streams that they already have, and that made sense. So that is what happened in our discussion, and if anybody has any other questions, put them in the chat and we'll answer them. I'll turn it back to, I don't know if Dennis is presenting or if it's Barbara.
This is Dennis. I don't know if I'm going to be able to present. I've got huge connectivity issues. I'm not getting nothing but can everybody, can you hear me, Barbara? And
about 3/4 of that. Do you want to try one more time? And if that doesn't work, I'll go.
Well, I don't know what the connection problem is, so it might be smoother just to let you take over.
Okay, I'll go ahead and do that. So this is Barbara Teague, and I'm going to substitute for our wonderful moderator of the third SHRAB Roundtable that we had in September on SHRAB regrants that Dennis from Arizona ran for us. Becky, could I have the next slide, please? And Dennis also did what Kathy and Dave did and invited some guests to help talk about their the Regrant programs in their state. So Dennis hosted Jim Kitchus from Utah and Rick Hendricks from New Mexico to talk about their regrants. Next slide, please. And Utah has had a fairly long-standing program of regrants, if I recall, and they have an administrator who works on the Regrant program. I don't think it's a full-time administrator. We'll have to ask about that, but I think it's part of their SHRAB grant, and the person who's dedicated to the SHRAB does administration of the Regrant program too. Their funding is a pretty healthy $60,000 to $65,000 to $70,000 per year, and they have a wide eligibility with archives and libraries and special collections at other sites around the state that are eligible. They're using a paper application. They were really interested to hear about some of the changes that the other panelists and other participants in the roundtable had discussed about simplifying applications, having electronic applications, but currently they're using a paper application. And they require a one-to-one match from their participants, and I think that also includes in-kind matching, not just cash. And they have fairly simple reporting requirements with an interim report and then a final one. And they're happy to have a couple of the tribes in Utah, the Ute and the Shoshone Northwest, participate. Next slide, please. And then Rick Hendricks from New Mexico told us about their program. It's about the same as Utah's in funding, with $65,000 a year to do regrants with institutions around the state, all nonprofit. They also require an in-kind match, and everyone who had attended the roundtable is really interested to hear about this simplified application that went from a whopping 17 pages to only three pages, with a simple description and a work plan and the intended audience. So I think we can all probably learn from the streamlining of that application process. And they have a panel, not just their Historical Records Advisory Board members who do the review of the regrant applications, and they include a site visit midway through the year to check on the progress, which everyone thought was a really great idea. And I think that was also one of the issues, as you know, Massachusetts had mentioned in the traveling archivist program, it was good to have the roving archivist make a visit before the regrant, before the regrant application was considered. And I'm not quite sure how they were going to do the site visits in COVID, but they did intend to make some kind of, and if Rick is here, he could probably tell us a little bit more about it, but I'm not really sure how they intend to do the site visits, but they did intend to continue to make contact with their regrant recipients. And one interesting thing he mentioned, and one thing we all learned on the roundtable, was there's such a thing as an acid Western, which is like a metaphorical spaghetti Western from what Rick described. And there was a copy that one of the institutions in the States had of this 1965 acid Western called The Devil's Mistress that they then digitized so that they could save it for posterity. Next slide, please. And too bad Dennis is going to listen to me talk about his own regrant program, so he'll have to correct me in the chat if I say anything that's incorrect. They have a smaller regrant program with $25,000 in grants per year, but they also do a lot of outreach to their institutions during the year with an annual symposium and other things that they do with institutions around the state. And they have a smaller match with a 25% match, and also a 3-page application process, so that maybe New Mexico learned from Arizona with the shorter application process. And their board members do the reviews of the grant applications and the evaluations and the recommendations for funding. And then the institutions who receive grants host an Archives 101 workshop and then have an end-of-the-year report. That workshop idea is really good because then they're sharing information with the staff of the institutions who receive the regrants, as well as I guess anyone else who wants to attend. And one of his interesting regrant projects was that the Lowell Observatory had 70 years of glass plate negatives that were digitized partially with assistance from the Arizona SHRAB. And that is my substitution, I believe, for Dennis. So if you have questions, if you type them in the chat, I think Dennis is still here and he would be able to answer them, and the rest of us could pipe in too. Next slide, please. If you go to the question and answer slide, I think we have those in a little bit. The next slide. Okay, thank you. And I'll turn it over to Alan for any questions that we have. We don't really have any in the chat yet, but if you would type them in, we'll be happy to answer them.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. Definitely, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. And I guess to get us kind of started, I thought of a few questions maybe that we could kind of look at. And one was, since we've through these we've talked about some different areas, and I was just wondering if anyone thought if there's anything else that we might have missed that would be useful to sort of look at over the next year or so. I know we've had this discussion on education and training, sort of what we would do as a thing next year in the committee. So I just wanted to throw it out there to everyone who's participating today, if there's anything that we, I'd really like to learn about this or that, or if any questions about what we've gone over in the roundtable so far.
Ellen, I have a question. May I ask it? And I'm sorry, I see there's one in the chat, but we'll get to that. I wondered, one of the things that we had talked about, I think on almost all of those roundtables, was is there any chance for some more regional cooperation among SHRABs? If you all would want to talk about that, maybe what you see, how we could, if CoSA could facilitate that, or if that could be facilitated through the regional archival associations. I don't know if you want to talk about that. Any of the panelists.
Barbara, this is Dave. I know that came up at our meeting, and I was going to throw that out as a question. In my notes, I had that CoSA had offered to do something on the website and either list or, any of those regional things, or offer suggestions. I don't know if that is still on the table from CoSA, but I think that would be somewhat helpful. And I know we've talked about trying to do some sort of a regional thing with the regional SHRABs at one of those regional conferences. Had SAA happen this year, for example, up in Chicago, I know we were in discussions to have maybe Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin have a regional SHRAB meeting and have discussions like that. I think that would be a great way to move forward, is not just do it by state, but by region. That way you get to see what you have in common, what you have in difference, and what you can work on together.
I think it's a great idea. And Jody and I are actually meeting right after this to talk about what Montana and Wyoming could potentially do together. But, big rural states, large territories to cover, that's something that we have in common. Then I'd love to talk with other states that have that same situation. That'd be great.
I think, now that we've gotten used to really not, if you're thinking about doing something regionally, you could also think about what are your areas of expertise and have, groups that are built around a certain, a project, or, you, like you're saying, you could have a traveling archivist group, but there could be other groups, and we wouldn't necessarily be limited by geography now that we're all so good at video meeting. Or we're learning, I guess. Alan, I think there is a question in the chat box.
Lori Ashley asked, Are there any new, different questions about SHRAB in the upcoming biannual survey?
Veronica is on here, and she's running the survey for us. So I will try to answer. And Veronica, you can correct. Oh yes, I would want you to answer that. So that would be great. Can we unmute her?
Everybody. Yes, there are some additional questions around the SHRABs, and actually specifically around collaboration in the SHRABs. So there is a question where we asked, have you participated, either your SHRAB or your state archives, in any sort of collaborative regional activities? So that's a big new question that we were trying to gauge cooperation within. If anyone hasn't seen it, all of there are copies of all of the surveys, the blank versions of them, available on the CoSA website. And I will take this moment to plug those people on this call who have not completed their surveys yet. Please do so. You've got a month. And thank you very much to those of you who have completed. We now have 6 states who have done and turned in all of their surveys. Including Beth Golding from Florida, who I saw was on here. So, yay, Beth.
Yay, Beth. And we're also supposed to give a shout out to South Carolina because they were the actual very first. So the Southeast is doing really well. You all need to catch up. Oh, and Lori also had one more comment, Alan.
Yep. And so the other comment from Lori was maybe add some profiles of projects, pictures, and quotes captured by the traveling archivist and post to the CoSA website, which I think would be a great idea to show sort of the different activities that traveling archivists, roving archivists, and even the fellowships do. That's all a good idea to me.
And may I say one thing about that? I think everyone probably knows because we've been talking about it for, 8 months or 10 months, but CoSA is going to have a new website, so it's going to be redesigned. It's going to look very modern. It's going to be easier, we think, for us to add information. And we think, like if, for instance, if Massachusetts wanted to post something about their traveling archivist program, we think we could give them permission to post, and so it would make it easier. Like it wouldn't have to be, will you post this for me? Oh yes, I will you look and see what it looks like? It'd be okay, we've posted it. And we're also going to have, when Kathy mentioned that we'd have new listservs based on different function areas, we would also do that through the website software. So when the website comes, everyone's life is going to be better. Or at least that's what I'm hoping. I guess I have one more question. Is there anybody else on here who does Regrant programs? I'm really interested in the mechanics of that, basically, because, I was in Kentucky as the state archivist, and I was the deputy coordinator of the SHRAB for, years before that, and we never really could get our regrant. It just seemed like it was too complicated to do, even though we had a local records grant mechanism. Having a regrant, it seemed it was just going to be, the hurdles were just going to be, we just weren't able to get it. We weren't able to do it, and I just wonder, are there other people on here who find that that's not really, it looks to me, when we were listening a couple of weeks ago to Rick and Jim and Dennis, that a regrant program is very doable, but it always just seemed unsurmountable to us for some reason.
Wyoming, and I'll give a big shout out to our accounting department because I wouldn't be able to manage that part of it. But, excuse me, the biggest problem I'm having at this point is that people aren't applying for the grants. But when they do, it's pretty smooth. And we actually do contracts that go through our AG's office, and even that isn't terribly complex.
Yeah, I would echo what Kathy said. We've had one this first year, and we didn't get the applications we thought we were going to get. The pandemic probably didn't help either. So that's been a struggle. The paperwork can be a little onerous, but we have the same kind of issue with other things we do. So.
We have in Illinois, we've done it for a decade now, and of course we like to think we have it down. The one thing I like about the Regrant program, I mean, kind of the offshoot type benefits, is it gives us a chance, you know, the SHRAB members themselves who come from all over Illinois, and certainly those of us at the State Archives who help staff the SHRAB, it gives us a chance to see what's going on out in the state in terms of archives, because we give these grants, we give preference to smaller institutions. I've met some great archivists that I never would have met just because of the Regrant program. We do site visits, which are so important. We now have established a mentor program, so some of our board members go to these small institutions or at least touch base with them and talk to them about, you know, their grants and the problems they're facing. And I've learned more about, you know, the archival community in Illinois and just what's going on out there in Illinois history. And that's almost a fringe benefit for the site visit that you don't maybe think of when you have these, when you have the regrants. You think you're helping these programs, and you are, but you're helping yourself in a lot of ways. And that's a huge benefit. And I know at the roundtable, I forget which person mentioned it, we mentioned how much he enjoyed doing the site visits. And when I talk to my SHRAB, you know, SHRAB members go on the site visits, but I go on all of them. And honestly, it's the highlight of my year. The COVID's made some changes, and we're going to have to make some adjustments, of course. But again, I've met some wonderful archivists, seen some great programs, you really get a sense for seeing how important the Regrant program is. So there's a lot of benefits to board members as well, not just for the Regrant participants, but the program itself is just very beneficial in a lot of ways you wouldn't expect.
Good, a good commercial for a SHRAB for anything. Oh, and Dennis agrees with you. He has a comment in the chat that regrants are awesome. You have an opportunity to provide much needed funding to small institutions, and it is great to meet archivists around the state and see what they're doing. Are there any other questions or comments? Well, I mean, I think this has been a really good discussion, and it's a good summary of, I'm sorry, Alan, I didn't mean to step on your toes, but I think it's just,
go ahead. Yeah.
It's just been really good. You know, I think the roundtables were a really good idea when we weren't able to meet in person in Chicago with the CoSA SAA meeting, the CoSA Education Committee, and Kathy was on the subcommittee that sort of designed what we're going to do to substitute for our 1 hour meeting when we see each other at the annual meeting. And this has been a great substitute for the 1 hour. We had 3 1-hour discussions plus this summary webinar. So it's been great to have everyone participate in this. And thanks so much to our roundtable chairs, Dave and Kathy and Dennis. So Alan, I'm sorry, I'll give it back to you.
Well, I think there's no additional questions or comments. I'm not seeing anything in the chat box. I think it's back to you for what's coming up and so forth.
Oh, okay. I am doing the announcements today. So we have a couple of webinars that are coming up. We're really excited. We have a webinar with the National Archives next week on preserving audiovisual materials at NARA, and then the Pennsylvania State Archives is participating as well. We've been working on this for a couple of months and had to put it off because of the pandemic, but we finally gotten organized and were able to have this webinar during Archives Month and right before Electronic Records Day. So it really is going to be a great webinar, and hope you'll register for that. I think the NARA speaker has been featured on like the Discovery Channel because he found he processed some materials from one of the Apollo launches. So I think he's going to have some interesting things to say. And then Pennsylvania does a lot of reformatting of audiovisual materials, so we could all probably learn from them. And then we have two coming up later. I'm sorry, I made this slide and it's wrong. It's October 22nd and November 19th. So please don't pay attention to the written word. Sorry about that. We're going to do something new this year and have just feature some of our state archival programs and just do a general overview of what their archives and records management programs are like, what they do for outreach. So I think this will be sort of a get to know your state archives series. I think it'll be fun to have two of these in a row in October and November. We're featuring California and Louisiana in a couple of weeks and on October 22nd, and then Utah and the District of Columbia in November. Next slide, please. And as everyone knows, Electronic Records Day is coming up. It usually is on October 10th, but this year we're observing it on October 9th because that's a Friday. October 10th is Saturday, and of course we're going to have some things, at least on social media, on the 10th, but we assume that most people would be participating on the 9th, and we have a full day of tweets and Facebook posts and other things that we're going to share. So we're happy to have you join in with us from all your archives. And if you want to send us anything to make sure that we share it, just email it to me or to Ann Ackerson. And we also have a Siri webinar that's sort of our Electronic Records Day webinar, but we're not having it on Friday. We're going to have it on Tuesday, and it's going to introduce a new publication or new, guidelines that CoSA just issued about records management guidance for working at home, and this is going to be discussed during the webinar, which has a really very cute title, Home is Where the Records Are, Managing Records in a Teleworking World. Next slide, please. And then just in case you've forgotten how to get in touch with us, our website address will also be the same after we have the turnover to our new website and website provider. And then the Resource Center will still be available on the new CoSA website. We hope with some nicer searching functionality than we have now. And we're always on Twitter and Facebook, and our YouTube channel hosts all of our webinars, as well as we just started a new series this month thanks to our National Endowment for Humanities CARES grant, where Ann Ackerson, our communications coordinator, is going to interview a series of people just about some issues that are going on in the archival world now. And the first one is actually posted on YouTube. It's on our YouTube channel, and Ann is interviewing Steve Murray about the Alabama Department of Archives and History Statement of Recommitment, where they have committed to look back at any kind of policies and practices that they may have undertaken or may currently be undertaking that don't promote racial justice. They want to make sure that they're being fair to all the citizens of Alabama, and it just is a really interesting interview if you have time to listen to it, and it's a great document as well, and you can have access to that. It's either on our webpage under the NEH CARES grant, or it's on the YouTube channel. And that's the first of the interviews. There's going to be several more things coming. Next slide, please. Oh, and we wouldn't be here if it weren't for our sponsors and funders. APEX funded and sponsored all of our SHRAB roundtables and this webinar as we transition from hosting that at an annual meeting in person to doing it online. So we really are very appreciative of their sponsorship, as well as our other sponsors, Ancestry, Family Search, and Preservica, AVP, Polygon, Gaylord Archival, and Atlas Systems, and then our 3 federal funders, NHPRC, the NEH, which is a new CoSA funder just this year, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. So we really appreciate all of our corporate funders, and we're very appreciative for the federal funds, particularly the CARES funding from NEH for this year, which helped us with our some of the funding that we lost through the pandemic. Next slide, please. Oh, and we were so happy to have you here, and you get to tell us if you enjoyed it and what we could do better, and also if you have ideas for things that we could offer as webinar topics in the future. The Education Committee is currently looking at topics for 2021, so this is a great time to let us know what you think. But thank you for participating today. We're very happy to have all of you here, and thank you so much for our presenters, Dave Jones, Kathy Marquis, and Dennis Priestler. We really appreciate it, and thank you, Alan, for moderating, and Becky, always, for your good technical support. So thanks, everyone.
And as Dennis mentioned, thank you to all our scribes during the different roundtables.
Right, the scribes, that's really important. So thank you.
Yes.
Good point, Alan. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, everyone.